My name is Ilya Kanaev. I'm a Doctor of Philosophy and an Associate Professor at Mosковский University for the Humanities. And today I want to have a conversation and investigation with the Doctor of Philosophy, Elizabet Vу Li. She's also the founder of the Sinological Development Charitable Foundation, and now she is doing her scientific research in the Cambridge University. Yes? Everything is correct.
Well, I think science, investigation in science, philosophy of science.
Philosophy of science is your maybe main professional field for today.
No,
No?
my investigation at Cambridge will be focused on the philosophy of science, because prior to that I do the other type of philosophy, but I want to focus more on the philosophy of science there, which is what the Needham Institute specializes in. Science. Oh, I didn't send you my new outline. I forgot last night. Yeah, on top of aesthetic, socio-political, politics, moral ethics, I am now adding an element of philosophy of science for Zhang Zai. Zhang Zai is from the 12th century, and my focus of all my research is on him, but I'm using different aspects of Western philosophy to explain his scheme. His schematic structure is so rich that it cannot just be explained through one single type of Western philosophy. So I am now inviting aesthetics, socio-political, moral ethics, ethical, as well as philosophy of science to work together to have a contemporary view, understanding of what Zhang Zai was trying to say to us. It's complicated, but
Yes.
I think it's necessary because the organic nature of Chinese philosophy is not completely focused, can be just analyzed into one area. It is inclusive and it embraces different disciplines. So it's an interdisciplinary topic, which is why it's so difficult to understand Confucianism. Confucianism is not just aesthetic, not just even medicine, which is why philosophy is science, because the medical aspect is scientific in the Western sense, but in the Chinese sense, it is something under the philosophy and thoughts, and it's hard to separate. And so even in the Western sense, we say, where do we place science? We place science as an explanation of practical life, so that here, Chinese philosophy is a practical investigation and understanding of the universe. And so it's so difficult to separate out, to say, oh, the society and the individual and nature, none of this is separated.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So in order for Chinese philosophy, Chinese thought, Chinese system, my area of specialization is with a Song Dynasty philosopher called Zhang Zai, and I'm using aesthetics, socio-political, moral, ethical, and the philosophy of science to look into his whole system, because I feel that in order to have a dialogue and in order for other traditions to understand one of our most important philosophers, I must use their languages and their way of looking at the worldview to explain his thoughts. And the rites as principles is one of the fundamentals, actually not created by Zhang Zai, but it's from the preaching Confucian writing, which he believes needs to be developed as a monistic cyclical system, because in the second half of the Song dynasty, the Bivarian aspect of logic and influence came into some of our philosophy, which is different from the traditional preaching philosophy.
And so, it's clear. We can turn to your paper. I read it and I liked it very much. The paper called The Rites as Principles, yes? And I wanted to consider it with you to have a conversation. And the first question I want to clarify for myself. What is rites? In maybe very simple, in few words. What is rites as you see it?
Rites in the Chinese classics, there is the Book of Rites. And rites is something we can translate into ceremonies, rituals, way of doing something. Even today, if you go to China, and the way that one would hand over a card to a stranger, or who would sit at the table at the head and next to who, these are all small manifestations of rites. But in the classical age, ancient time, 3,000 years ago, the rites can be perceived almost as law. That means if you are in the court of the emperor as a minister or official, and in the family, the way you treat your parents or brother, there are rights and regulations and rules which throughout the 3,000 years of history, there has been times when it's punishable and times when it's just seriously considered. And what do I mean by sometimes it's punishable, sometimes it's seriously considered? Because law in China has gone through different periods of we can say it's not parties, but it's more like the legalists and the Confucianists are two ideology in China. Confucians believe in rights as everyday manifestation, and the legalists would put it in the law. So legalism, which is called 法家, and Confucianism is called 儒家. And the legalists would make laws that are more behaviorist, meaning if you do well, we reward you. If you are doing bad things, we will punish you. So it's a reward punishment system. Confucians believe that the humanistic approach of love from the heart. And how is love from the heart trained is through at a very young age, through this process called rites, or training, the ceremony of how the children must say good mornings, etc., etc. And now the cognitive scientists, such as Edward Singland and other people, are investigating why it is that the training of the rites from a very young age, what does it do cognitively, make the person feel happy when they do something right in terms of what they were trained when they were young. So the difference between those who have been trained and those who have not, and those who observe the rites and those who do not. It's hard to say, is it law, is it rules, is it just a way of treating other people? So it's a very complex issue.
Maybe I finally caught the idea, it's very good. The difference between the rights and the law. Clarify, please. To the man or the child, the man begins to rule rights from his birth, yes? No, maybe from his childhood.
Well, Chinese children, that's why some people mistaken Confucianism to be something authoritarian. Because you have to listen to the father, your elder brother, your superior. So is it authoritative? And there are writers who condemn this, to think that in the Chinese culture, Confucianism is too rigid or too rote learning or too this, to that, not free enough. But there are studies now that finds it necessary to do this kind of training.
I don't want to talk about necessity or not necessity. I want to clarify that the rights is taught from the beginning of the life of a man. Yes.
Yes, all children of tradition.
Yes. When a man
is born,
then he should know after some time, from the very, very small age,
young age,
he is beginning to learn the rights, and he is taught. He's taught with rights, and when he became the adult and the big man,
that is already internalized.
Yes, and he is used to all these rights. And this is rights. And the law. There is no law for small children, I think, in any function.
Law is something that is, we need to, and that's my investigation now, and there's a lot of studies being done. Law is from the Qin dynasty, the legalists, 法家, begin to write the law, but as I said, is in a behaviorist approach.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. We have the same laws.
But this law is in the court, in the emperor, and that's punishable if you go to court and you get the punishment. Right?
And it's very formal.
Very formal.
If you do robbery,
robbery, then the law is written and so on. But also, because the 3,000 years of history in China, sometimes the legalists are in power, sometimes the Confucianists are in power, and so the different period, the law, sometimes when the Confucians are in power for the emperor, they also influence the law, and they try to put more of the rites and rituals and those aspects into the law. So the law in China's the development can be said that has both the humanistic and the behaviorist integration. through the many centuries of establishment. There's also this thing called the five relationship, which is in Confucianism, which is very clear. The husband and the wife and the brothers, those relationship is known to everybody. And so really the rites is to ensure that these relationships are carried out and everyone knows it. We can talk about it from that point of view, but I cannot talk about it from the point of view of the law, because right now that is the aspect that is so unclear throughout history. That is it if you, the husband has the right to kill the wife if he finds her to have adultery. But I don't want to say this as a blank thing, but in the old days, yes, this was sort of understood in the relationship of the five relationship. So generally I speak about the five relationship, which is a fundamental of the rites. It's okay because that's ethics. That's the ethics of the interpersonal ethics, which the whole society is based on.
But may we say that the aim of the rites is to become the internal
yes,
to become the internal structure of the man of his behavior. Constitutive
rather than regulative, although it looks regulative. We can talk about that. I mean, it at the young age, the rites is a way to regulate the young people
who doesn't understand what they do.
Right.
And why they must, for example, honor their parents.
Right. So that when they're older, this essence, there's this aspect of the essence of the rites, which is internalized, which then becomes part of the person. And that person, at the next level, he becomes a gentleman, or what we call 君子. And then he can model this and show it to the peasants and other people, shouldn't say peasant, the regular people who has not reached the position of a gentleman. They model it. They model this, and then at the next stage, they can, if they go the first level is a scholar because they study all the classics, and then the next level is the gentleman, and then further, of course, they become the sage, but very few people reach the sagehood. I'm not sure I should talk about that. But that's what sagehood is all about, right? The development and the sainthood. So.
Yes, I see.
The external behaviorist training is what people see in the rites of Confucianism. But actually, another aspect, when the person or the child is old enough, they begin to internalize the essence of understanding the respect for the elders, for the wise, for the whatever, the relationship, the five relationships. And it's no longer like the little animal where you give them a sugar or biscuits and they roll over, because they feel actually from a humanistic point of view that this internal motivation is constitutive inside themselves rather than being forced upon them.
Yes.
And I think oftentimes people talk about Confucianism in a way that is not clear, because actually internal to Confucianism there is legalism, and legalism is the behavior training of reward and punishment, whilst the Confucian aspect is more the humanistic, if we were to use more Western terms to explain it. And I tend to use a lot of Western terms to try to understand, because I feel that unless we can explain to people who understands other terminology what we actually have inside Confucianism, otherwise it will be hard to understand.
Yes, and it's very good that you use the maybe modern Western notions and terms, because using them you can use the modern science, the cognitive science, the psychological science, and the neurophysiological science, and in these sciences you can find the proofs that the continuous training may change the whole structure of the mind, of the body. Of course not, I won't have wings, but my body may be very different. For example, we were walking, before, and you saw that there are many types of human bodies. One body is very heavy, he has a lot of fat, he's unable to move, yes. It's his structure of body. For example, I have another structure of the body, but it's only because of my trainings. If I won't train, if I won't do the rites, if I won't get up every morning and make jogging and work out, I will have the same body as that man. And this is the rites for me. It doesn't depend what the weather is, what the mood I have. Do I want to do this or do I don't want to do this? I should do this. And only through this I can change my mental structure and my physical structure too. Of course, in some borders, yes? Yes, so I think we clarified what is rights, and the next question is, what is principle? Yes?
Well, principles is
in
Chinese is the character is written with the king on one side, then there is a field, and then there is the earth. The whole character is configuration. But the etymology of this word comes from first cited as the patterns within the jade. So some people will use it and explain it as patterns or orderliness. But in a philosophical approach to discuss Li, these principles, we normally will say this is the principles from heaven. So what is the principle from heaven? I mean, it took me years to understand myself. Finally, many scholars will say the principles from heaven is actually the normative aspects of society. So it's the unseen culture, the reason that people know what to do, that is internalized. And we don't forget, China is a high context civilization. What is a high context civilization? We have 3,000 years of tradition. Everyone knows the classics. Yes, there was maybe 30, 50 years when we were not allowed to read the classics. But what is 50 years in 3,000? It's not very much. So today, if you talk to any taxi driver in Beijing or in China or in Malaysia, everyone knows what Confucius talk about in terms of respecting your parents, which we call filial piety. Xiao is the most important part. That's why in the old days, having old age home is such a shame, because it is like oh, your children are not taking care of you in their old age. That is so shameful. And don't forget, China versus the West, we are in a shame culture rather than a guilt culture. In the Christian world, everything is the internal guilt. But in China, definitely it's shame. So they're always talking about face. I will lose face because other people will say, you are shame because your children not taking care of you and sending you to old age home. Of course now it's accepted because you have very nice old age homes and people taken care of very well. But the shame of not taking care of your parents, even the lowest, poorest person will spend the time and money and organize for their parents' old age. And this is innate. So this norm and this principle from heaven is what is manifest in the society for 3,000 years. And this manifestation can be looked at in terms of why the children from very young was taught the rites. But the rites, of course, they also have marriage rites, funeral rites, court rites, very complicated rites that everybody makes sure that when you go to the funeral, the number one son, the number two daughter-in-law, everyone has a specific place to sit and so on and so forth. But all of these rites actually are the same in terms of principles. So that's why this phrase, these three little words, rites as principles, is the topic of my investigation.
So the rites as principles, you said the principle is some kind of structure of the upper world of the sky, yes?
Well, they say it's from heaven, it's the principles from heaven, but there's no God that created these principles.
Yes, in Russian language we translate your notion not like heaven but like sky.
Sky, yes.
Because heaven is Christianity,
yes,
with many saints, gods, and so on. And sky is above everything.
Yes, we because our many of our translated words like principles in heaven and all this was done early in the 19th century and a lot of missionary involvement. Yes. So we use heaven, but you are right. Sky is really the more generic. But we also when we write it, we capitalize heaven, but we also capitalize human. So that means the human and the heaven is on the same level. So it's not one bigger than the other. You can, some people, different ways. They don't capitalize heaven or human, but because a lot of times human and heaven is talked about at the same time because the whole fundamental of Chinese philosophy is the ability for the human to be able to communicate with heaven, and at some stages only the emperor is supposed to do that, but the word is tong. Tong, some people have translated as throwness, like throw something out. Not quite like what Heidegger talks about in terms of projection, but I sometimes translate this word tong as transposition. It's like you know, you can, it's like a thoroughfare where you can, one affects the other. So at the end of the day, this sky or heaven is actually can be discussed in terms of the normative, social, acceptable way of life. The system and the structure is the principle. So this principles comes from the sky, come from heaven, so on.
But they are manifested in the human world.
It manifests and into behavior, where the behavior you can see is the rites. One is the principle, which is cannot see, so that is more on a level of conception, because the norms, you cannot see the norms of a society unless it's manifest. So it's manifest in the rites.
But you told that about the cycle, about the principles and their manifestations, yes? So
Yes.
manifestations somehow maintain the existence of the principles, or not?
Yes, and there's no divided line. There is no practice is on one level, and the idea or
The
ideal
theory.
theory is on another level. It is a cycle because it influences each other in the Chinese way, and that's where the monistic versus dualistic aspect comes in.
Yes, I see, because maybe without any manifestations of, let's imagine that some principle has no manifestation at all. It will not exist, yes?
No.
It will be in some maybe possibility or...
And the Chinese philosophy does not entertain possibilities and abstracts and potentials.
Yes.
It's a very practical philosophy. Anything that is not seen and done and heard is basically rarely discussed. There's no perfection, abstract perfection of what that final goal needs to absolutely look like.
Yes.
In a process-oriented culture as China and the Chinese thought, it's the process of walking towards there and making your journey to get there rather than a destination. So it's not a solution that we have to reach in terms of being perfect, but it's a process of getting there. Well, what's really interesting in my investigation is that I have some political scientist or a philosopher discussing Confucianism and using the word aspirational, and this particular word, even Confucius himself thinks that to become a sage is an aspiration, and he never thought that he became a sage, although his students honor him to be a sage. And Zhang Zai also, all his life he spent on understanding what is being a sage, and he aspires to be a sage. But there's Joseph Chan, who used the word aspirational in his political philosophy. He discussed it as a sense of hopelessness, that, oh, it's impossible to reach that. But then I read Joseph Margolis, who writes about the Constitution of the United States from an aesthetic point of view, where they use the aspirational word as well. And their aspiration is a direction to go towards, and it's not hopeless. And I'm very interested in why there is this opposing view, one word of aspiration, because as we say, to aspire to something towards a direction, the ideal, whether it's abstract or perfection, You see, in my understanding, the Confucians never think they get there, and not getting there is really okay, because it's a direction to get there. But in Joseph Chan's discussion, he finds it very burdensome, because it's almost like he must get there, otherwise he's not perfect. And I think this perfectionist approach may have something to do with the fundamental of the bivariant truth of having to get there so that it's not false. Whereas if you're using a more monistic approach, you would say that, well, it's okay that we don't actually get there, but we get close to it, it's okay. And I think in the ethical system of Christine Swanton, who writes about a threshold of how people increase their virtuosity, is also connected less towards a perfectionist view, but rather a directional view. Really, in order to have a fruitful dialogue, it's not just to put any Western conception into explaining Chinese philosophy. That would be very wrong. But it has to be a system that is compatible. What I mean by compatibility is that the mode of thought behind the system of philosophy has to match up. And I think the relativist view from Joe Margolis and the pluralistic from Christine are going to be very useful. I'm still working and struggling through with the political analysis or philosophy of Joseph Chan. But, this is an investigation. And I think at the end of the day, I believe that we first must understand the way a tradition thinks. That means we cannot assume that the Chinese and the West are under the same pattern of thought. And I think without understanding the mode of thought, which we call 思维 in Chinese, it would be very dangerous to try to do comparative or dialogues between, and which is why I try to use the anthropological approach that Sir Geoffrey Lloyd is using at the Needham Institute, where I will be doing further research, because what he does is he takes the situation from an anthropological analysis of one cohort or tradition and compares it with the other, but not in terms of apples to orange, because the properties are different. And you can't compare aspects when the properties are different. And that's where I appreciate Joseph Margolis' contribution. You see, one of my problems, and Margolis says the same, he says because when we speak, it's a process, and we don't know our knowledge. And when it comes out, I forget already what I said, but